Good evening. I'm Mark Figueroa. I'm a research fellow at SALISES. In light of the time, I'm not going to welcome any of our special guests, but we're very happy to see you all, especially of those from our campus and from those who are joining us online. Briefly, for those of you who don't know Dillon is a graduate of the Consortium Graduate School, along with some of our other esteemed colleagues here who were in class with him. And this was one of the constituent parts of SALISES, along with the longer-standing Institute for Social and Economic Research. He was subsequently a colleague here at SALISES before moving over to the Department of Economics here at Mona, and then to ECLAC, where he's now the Deputy Director at Port of Spain's Sub-Regional Office. I now hand you over to Dillon to present to us on the way out of our debt crisis.
Thanks, Mark. We argue that any strategy, sustainable development strategy for the Caribbean, must be focused on at least two things: enhancing growth and reducing the debt at the same time. Those are critical things. There are other things which reducing unemployment and so on, but these are critical ingredients. And ECLAC believes that this is possible through the investment in what we call green growth, green expansion in green industries. Some people call it structural transformation in the green sector, but the point of the matter is that green industries, technologies and green goods in 2014 totaled some $1.4 trillion. This is one of the growth areas. We argue that green industries can contribute to sustainable development and poverty reduction in a range of areas. Energy, and Jamaica has been very much focused on expanding renewable and energy efficiency. Agriculture, if one reads the Planning Institute report and the Bank of Jamaica reports on the economy every year, the concern is agriculture. That agriculture, but weather conditions, it's a serious problem. Other sectors, but what happens to agriculture is important. So we talk about sustainable agriculture. Infrastructure, a big area. Why infrastructure is important? It's very much a complement to private sector development. The governments have an interest in expanding infrastructure. Education, health, and tourism. We argue that education and health, in particular, have always been seen as domestic activity. We think that these should be export activity. There's no reason why health services can't be seen as global services, which is provided by Caribbean people. I argue that the Vision 2030 for Jamaica is a very interesting document and does highlight some aspects of green industrial development. But I think that it doesn't emphasize, and it talks about a world-class education, but it doesn't emphasize, I think importantly, the provision of global education harnessed for the provision of global services, which is where global expansion is going to be, we think, in addition to green industries. Many Caribbean countries have prioritized renewable energy and many have targets, and I think that this is an area of considerable opportunity for green expansion. And it's really a pathway to resilient development, which is the SDGs, which many Caribbean and other countries have signed on to as a new way of thinking of development, where development must embrace not just economic and social, but environmental. let's go to the heart of this. What is the ECLAC response to the debt challenge? As I say, the paper sets that out very clearly, so we don't have to. We argue, essentially, that the Green Climate Fund is perhaps the only source of concessional finance in the globe today. Major source. We also argue that small states and other states are entitled to these funds. And while it is true that the funds pledged have not always matched up with the funds that are available, the point is these are considerable resources. These resources are there. These resources, a certain portion of these resources have been put aside for small states, LDCs, and so on. But Caribbean countries have not been accessing these funds in large quantities. So it's a very complex process of accessing the Green Climate Fund resources. We think that a wonderful way of addressing the debt problem and at the same time furthering growth through green industries and addressing these SDGs would be to approach the Green Fund and it's very important that I emphasize this, we are not talking about writing off the debt. We're talking about purchasing the debt, which is about 49 billion, it's about 1% of global debt. Solving that problem will not create any systemic global financial crisis. It's a small sum. We approach the fund and we say, look, you are well aware of this debt problem which the Caribbean faces. It is so severe that a fiscal surplus is required to address the debt. Is itself causing growth to decline? And we have demonstrated this. And the World Bank and the IMF makes the point that in the highly developed, highly debt-stressed Caribbean countries, the primary surplus required to keep the debt at a certain level and bring it down is severe. Jamaica has to meet a target of 7.5% GDP. It's enormous relative to historical experience. So the Green Fund will simply be the source of these resources. The debt repayment, which will continue, but we hope at a discount, will be put into a Caribbean Resilience Fund. The nuance of the Resilience Fund could be discussed among creditors and debtors who will manage it. So, you know, there's opportunity here for all parties to be involved in the management of this. And of course, we think that the multilaterals, institutions must be involved as well because we owe at least $10 billion to the World Bank, the IMF, the IDB, and so on. But that is a small percentage of the total debt owed. And because of the heterogeneity of the debt, countries like Jamaica will not benefit from any proposal that is purely coming from the multilaterals. It was a small percentage of the total debt. Jamaica, Belize, Barbados, for example. But there are other countries that would benefit from a proposal that is purely driven by multilaterals. I raise this because the World Bank itself has a proposal and has been mulling over a pilot project for Jamaica. I'm not sure where that proposal is, but it's really about providing budgetary support and so on. Our proposal is that the Green Fund will absorb some of this debt, and the repayment cost goes into Caribbean Resilience Fund, which is managed by itself. Yeah. So for countries with a high debt from official creditors, World Bank and so on, use the fund to write off multilateral, bilateral debts at a discount. Of course, this is a combination of concessional and loans. I think concessional and loans or concessional debt is about 5 billion. For countries with high debt from private creditors, we talk about Jamaica and Belize, as I've said, and so on. Some sort of buyback scheme will be required because you're talking about the private sector. So we've said before that the GCF funds will be used to finance gradual write-down of multilateral and bilateral. Debtors agreed to make annual payments to this Caribbean Resilience Fund. We could see this Resilience Fund as a fund which could be also capitalized from other sources. I mean, member states, developing countries would invest in this fund. It need not be just purely about receiving resources from debt repayment. Of course, there are a number of objections which we've heard before. One is that repaying the debt also has budgetary implications. Countries like Jamaica, for example, which spend about 50% of their budget on debt repayment, they have challenges. We are hoping that the new loan agreements, the new package, will essentially be at a lower discount, lower interest rate, and they're longer maturities. Because this is a problem with debt in the Caribbean. A number of people usually report the debt to GDP, and that's a problem. But it's really the interest cost and how quickly you have to pay that. That's really the problem. So with longer maturities, you allow the countries a little breathing space. And remember, our argument here is you're tying this to green investment. This is not just a debt reduction strategy. It's a broader strategy focusing on investment in green sector. Of course, there are issues of commercial banks and so on, and we argue that in those cases you may have an old debt for equity swap. There's an old strategy. Now, we are not only talking about debt reduction. We think that there are some complementary strategies that must go along with it. Clearly, many countries have to continue the structural reforms that they've been pursuing. Of course, Jamaica has pushed it very much in terms of fiscal rules and so on. We have to continue to expand the space for business activity and raise the share, and this is the point I was making about global service. We have to raise the share of new sectors in total activity. The idea of being able to squeeze 8 or 9% of existing sectors, we are not convinced it will happen. We have to search for new markets, including, for example, airlift to China, and opening the space for full engagement of the diaspora. And when I say full engagement of the diaspora, I don't mean diaspora conferences, which are useful. I'm talking about the opportunities for people to come here if they have a sabbatical, spend 6 months without losing their benefits, working with colleagues here, going back, working in all the ministries, a continuous flow and opening of the opportunity for continual engagement. That is what I'm talking about when I say engagement with the diaspora. Because they have proven in China and India and elsewhere an important linchpin for development. We must improve logistics and regional interconnection, especially through ICT. We still have to send money. If you're sending money from Trinidad to Jamaica, it still has to go to JP Morgan and come back down to Jamaica. this problem of correspondent banking has now reached us and needs a solution. We have to expand the space for regional interconnection and build regional value chains. Firms must be global in outlook. Global in outlook. The evidence is that few Caribbean firms export relative to the rest of firms in small economies. And that is why that graph shows the beautiful one. We must improve local technological capacity, best sought at regional level. I'm convinced that you can't build enough local capacity by focusing on Grenada. We need regional platforms. And not just regional in the sense of Caribbean. I'm talking about region in terms of the broader diaspora. And invest carefully in expanding, upgrading labor skills. This is what is linked to what I call not the world-class education, which is important, but the expansion or the ability to provide global service. So you're talking about learning by doing, learning by experimentation, learning to learn. These are some concepts which are now popular in literature. And public policy must focus on a longer-term planning horizon. It's not a new problem, not a new idea. I wouldn't touch this, but essentially what we're talking about here is what are the criteria for being part of the Debt for Climate Adaptation Swap Initiative. And we have outlined a few. And these may be subject to the member states having their own views on this. Notice we do not argue for an IMF program. Let me say that ECLAC has not just spoken about this, but we have been very much engaged with member states at our meeting of the CDCC in St. Kitts and Nevis. Many member states endorsed the broad principle of a debt for climate adaptation swap initiative through the Green Climate Fund. The Caribbean Commission has agreed that this is a worthy idea to pursue. And our executive secretary has been very vocal in all the major conferences, including the financing for development in Addis Ababa, on the need for providing some relief to Caribbean countries. But I want to make it clear in ending that we're not talking about debt write-off. We're talking about a strategy that promotes resilient growth, a strategy that reduces the debt, and at the same time provide fiscal space for the public sector to respond. I think ECLAC stands ready to engage stakeholders and other partners in developing this proposal forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dillon. You can see that SALISES has implemented the diaspora model. We have Dillon here on sabbatical. ECLAC as he proposed in his presentation. We are now moving into the question and answer section. And, go ahead, could you just identify yourself?
Yes, thank you. Damian King, Department of Economics. Not a question, just a corroborating comment. I think this is actually quite a clever program because you know, some work that I'm doing now that is looking at how highly indebted countries in this century have actually managed to go from substantial debt above 125% of GDP down to the sort of benchmark sustainable level of 60%, shows that so far no country has accomplished this on the basis of fiscal consolidation alone. And so it really requires some kind of, debt negotiated down way, and this allows us to access the climate funds to do so. So I think that is critical. The second point I want to make, and why I think this is a clever proposal, is because previous work done looking at the ultimate source of debt in the Caribbean shows the critical role that vulnerability and disasters have played in the accumulation of that debt. And so by tying it to the resilience fund, you're really getting at the root cause of debt in the Caribbean. So, my own first look at this is that it really is something that we need to build upon it.
Thank you. You could pass.
Yes, so I just wanted to ask about the challenges you foresee in implementing your model or making your model practical, I suppose. And if you could say a bit more about why it is that we've not actually used the fund, because you mentioned that we've not really drawn down on the fund.
Could you give the mic?
I'm not with that, Craig.
Thank you.
I know you're going to ask. I must say I was impressed by this presentation because it moved to try and identify an implementation approach that is as realistic as possible. And especially this final conclusion that's up on the board depends upon what one would call political economy issues. That is, our politicians need to want to have a model like this and have the desire and interest to make it succeed. And I thank Dillon again for referring to the external impact. Now, this model is not built in relationship to the external impact, but looking at the fact that we seem to be heading into a third industrial revolution involving biotech, nanotechnology, and so on, that we can't ignore what is happening there. We can't ignore what the World Bank is doing, having allowed the renminbi, the Chinese yuan, to be part of the currency there, and the effect all of this is likely to have on the US dollar, which is our reference dollar, and the impact that this will have on any fund, especially if it's expressed in US dollar, which is worse. So I just wanted to reflect on some of this.
I'm sorry I didn't get the paper. I didn't know you could have it. Yes. But first I want to know what is gross ROIC. And
Very small.
Yeah, but what do you want economies constitute?
I think all the UN definition of small economies, I think it's they're no more than 2 point something.
No, outside the population, what exactly who are these economies?
They're a category under the UN category, just like middle income countries.
Yes.
And
A lot of them are Pacific Island countries.
yeah.
And
Many
then,
islands.
yeah, but many of them are in the Pacific.
So other parts that I will check out.
Yes.
But what I think it's a very innovative idea. However, I'm a bit cynical because I'm stating in my mind what the policies you have stated and the policies which have been stated before. I have to see technological capability, the work is done here, SALISES and Institute, 1979. What makes it, what are you saying? Okay, let's say this is successful. What makes it happen that the economies don't get themselves back in that way? So I think that is a issue we should also address.
Go ahead. Just once.
Yes, just briefly, sorry I'm not saying the presentation, but I think I am familiar with the meeting presentation. And my question, which I've asked before, is along the lines of some of the questions is already. It's more in terms of political economy and implementation. Where countries have a lot of multilateral debt or a lot of market debt. In the case of multilateral debt, are you more encouraged that the other multilateral financial institutions are supporting what we said proposal and the type of in the case of market debt? What are the complications involved in terms of convincing newly set of market holders to engage in a proposal such as this.
Just the last one here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Giuseppe Urbano. I work in the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean. I am a program specialist for social and human sciences. So first of all, I would like to thank you for this presentation that I find is very comprehensive and indeed very original as a proposal. So from the point of view of a specialized agency that also strives towards the accompanying countries, different countries, so that they achieve the goals set in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I wonder if in your reasoning you have already foreseen cooperation mechanisms and if I can quote, so lines of action so that the different agencies, funds and programs can work together with ECLAC to make a case for the countries in the Caribbean so that they can apply to the funds, more specifically the Green Fund, and that these proposals are taken seriously and maybe granted with a positive reply. I think that the more the merrier, and indeed several UN agencies, constituencies gather together to accompany the countries in this type of proposals, probably the case will be stronger.
Yes, we are very much attuned to this. At the meeting in St. Kitts and Nevis, a special sidebar was called with the World Bank, the Commonwealth Secretariat, CDB, and ourselves, and we agreed actually that in principle the idea should work, and that we should form a small group, a working group that would map out the details of it. The Commonwealth Secretariat subsequently visited us, and we've been talking about it. The World Bank hasn't really gotten back to us. As you said, they are working on their own proposal. But there's an urgency, I agree with you, but there's an urgency here, and getting everybody together sometimes takes time. But, you know, we are very much aware of the need to bring more agencies together and to have a common fund. Agreed, there are a number of countries, there are a number of institutions in the Caribbean that are accredited to the Green Climate Fund. It's 5 Cs and recently the IDB, but their funding limit is small. And not the IDB, the CDB is 50 million or something. But the IDB has a bigger limit, upper limit. So we're looking at all those possibilities, and I'm sure that we could send to you the larger proposal and to get your feedback. But we are well aware of the need, but more importantly, we have to get the member states lined up as well, because it's their problem. Colin, yes, this is a technician's concern. What's going to happen when you suddenly say there's a debt swap? The Ministry of Finance will say, well, boy, this amounts to a default. Any kind of talk of debt, swap, new arrangement presumes a default and markets may respond. We think that if the multilaterals are involved, it will send a good signal. They have to be involved, by the way. It would begin to, and as I say, the bank has been mulling over this and has something in the works. So we think that strategically, if we could get them to participate, it would send the kind of stabilizing message that we would need. But this is a real problem. How markets respond, how secondary markets respond. But I mean, we're in real trouble. So, I mean, we can't just sit by and say, well, we worry about markets. You know, we have to move ahead. So, I take the point. But we believe that if the Green Fund, and we've gotten good positive signal from them, from officials associated with the fund, I think there's a lot of resources there, and if the argument could be made, we could get a lot of buying. But that's a problem which can't be solved a priori, but which is really on the horizon. And I agree with you. Lauren, the idea, to agree with you, some of these ideas are not brand new and will be modeled. You notice I didn't say diversification because that has a ring which I would rather avoid. But I think that small states like this could prepare themselves to provide global services, either under the EPA or either, I don't see you competing with China in manufacturing, or else it's niche manufacturing. Some of the countries are early movers, they've been in the game before. We have to start with where we have advantage, and then we move forward. And I'm saying that if you invest properly in your people, and you give them the kinds of tools, as the 2030 vision said, world-class education, but I think it's too broad. It must be education that provides global services in areas where we have advantage. So, the demographic transition tells us that in the North Atlantic and in Europe, there is an aging population. Before the robots come, we have an opportunity to provide services in these areas. There's going to be an automation, but I think there is a window. In the BPO sector, for example, automation is coming. And we have to be able to participate where we can, and then to be able to move to the next wave. That is what I call that's what I talk about the long-term planning horizon. We're not looking at what is happening today, but what is likely to happen in the next 50 years. So I think that some of these long-standing problems have to be addressed, and while it is true that some of the solutions are not I don't take the view, there's a view which says that unless the politicians are agreeable, nothing will happen, or unless, well, I don't know. If you look at what is happening in Asia, the interconnection among economies is now giving rise to political interconnection. It didn't go the other way like CARICOM. It was the connection in terms of global value chains and markets that gave rise to political. And so I'm saying that there are other ways of thinking about this which may circumvent the need. I'm not saying that the political arena is not important, but I'm saying that it doesn't close off. So, for example, we've been talking about movement of Caribbean people and the problems with the skills certificate. But if you go to Trinidad, there are large numbers of Jamaicans, they're working all over the place. These people are moving. And they're moving at greater cost than if you had a fully functioning, well-established. But, so I'm saying that we have to think about how we escape some of the structural impediments, some of which perhaps will not be removed, but will be left there even though people have circumvented it. I hope I've answered you fully. The issue of why it is that we've not been able to access the green climate. I think your question is, if the funds are there, why are we worrying about all these other mechanisms? Well, it's complex, and it requires a kind of capacity which many member states don't seem to have enough of. A few countries have accessed them, but if you look at the forms and instructions, they're extensive, and and require the kind of monitoring mechanisms to be put in place which many developing countries are struggling with. I think they could be overcome, but I'm saying that at the moment. So that is why we say that the resilience fund could be a way of circumventing some of these challenges. Yeah. The other thing is, I think it's also important to recognize that the heterogeneity of the debt doesn't allow for a single solution. So that, for example, for Jamaica, it may be the issue of the interest costs, not only the debt stock. While for Barbados, there may be other. So we're thinking of that, while in principle we may agree to a particular strategy, there are subtleties which may require a menu approach. And Dillon, my friend Dillon, I'm saying to myself, maybe it's getting older, but I remember another life you found it difficult to explain debt accumulation in terms of vulnerability. But it's wonderful to see that we're bringing on board all the evidence, and so we think that this proposal has merit. I agree with you.
Thanks. Where's Mike? Okay. We have one question. Anybody else who mention who you are, sir?
Richard Burnell. I am in the regional headquarters of Preston. But I'm here because I'm alum of the Econ department and what used to be ISA. My comment is, one, this is a practical proposal and it's well targeted given where money is available in the international arena at this time. However, given the variety of composition of debt across the Caribbean, this alone will not bring relief across the Caribbean and to all the highly indebted countries. It would have to be part of a larger initiative to restructure the debt. That larger initiative to restructure the debt has been proposed, so in a way this is practical to scale it down. However, this alone will not solve it. The larger proposal for an initiative for small, middle-income, highly indebted countries has not gained traction, nor has the Caribbean been able to articulate convincingly a strategy which will mobilize the political support of the major donor countries. Similarly, in the multilateral financial institutions in Washington, where I was until about 6 months ago, there is still skepticism about whether the Caribbean would make use of any such relief which will be given. So the problem here is not lack of technical solutions. The problem is to mount something which is comprehensive and addresses all the forms of debt simultaneously, and this could be an important component. But it is not at the level of policy where the Caribbean, our SIDS have just not been able to get any support in the US, in Europe, or in the multilateral financial institution. That is really the problem.
Thank you. We have a question right up front here.
Hi everybody, I'm Constant Nonke, I'm thank you for the original presentation. I would really like to get your comments on the incentive scheme around the proposal. Namely, I remember the years of the highly indebted poor country initiative. If you look at the debt level of those countries today compared to where they were before and right after the initiative, you will see that many of them have reverted back to the level prior to the initiative. So, which type of incentive would be put in place to ensure that, number one, the countries that benefit from it do really deserve, and how to prevent that it go back to the center. I think that's one point that one of the points. And in that context, how do you see the phasing of this? In the case of people, for instance, there were all kinds of eligibility criteria that were followed over time to make sure that there is policy traction, that there is strong commitment before the funds are dispersed. So as part of the incentive scheme. And I also think that at the end of the day will be also a matter of size. So we have a sense of the magnitude of the debt reduction that can be expected from the scheme, and because you have to put that in tandem with the reputational cost that you mentioned. So essentially, the country will be saying, okay, how much do I need from the initiative, and what are the potential costs? So at the end of the day, the country will be looking at this. But I like the fact that at least you have incentives from multilateral, in the sense that we all want a good climate, which is disproportionately damaged by countries across developing and advanced. So that scheme kind of in a way of equating gain and losses.
Okay, thank you. Our last question here.
Dillon, wonderful work. We have a simple question. We have a criterion of low growth in the eligibility criteria. And I think a lot of the reasons we're getting into debt across the 60 years or so in post-independence has a lot to do with the quality of the policies the member states have in place. To what extent do you think you can encourage member states to work with you to look at the package of policies to drive growth as part of the process of escaping the low growth cycle that's produced in them?
5 minutes. Let me start with finance, and I'll probably address Richard's point. As you know, finance, we've been engaged with 4 countries in the Caribbean so far in what we call public expenditure reviews. And these are really strategies to orient public priorities with public spending. And we've been amazed, you know, you've been part of this, amazed at the scandal, you may say, in some of the, in the way public resources are spent. But I think we are very clear that while they may instances of loose spending over time, there's a deeper developmental challenge which the Caribbean must confront. And it's not enough to solve it as merely cutting budgets and balancing budgets on an annual basis. These are important things, but I think it may not be sufficient to raise growth rates and per capita income at significant points in time, for reasons which I gave before. So we've been doing our bit in working with member states, and I think that there is no doubt that a lot more could be done. For example, a lot of tax expenditures, that is, ministries writing off revenues because of some special arrangement. Those are, ending many of those. The incentives to FDI, it's not clear, for example, whether these incentives really are giving us the bang for the buck. So there are a lot of areas where there could be improvement in public spending to raise taxes and to create efficiency. And as I say, we're very much involved with respect to trying to get streamlined public spending. on Richard's point, I mean, we spoke to the Treasury, I mean, our director, and they were very skeptical, U.S. Treasury, they're very skeptical. Said, for reasons you have given. These are middle-income countries, they have squandered their resources, and so on. That's a point of view which we don't, fully endorse. I think that we have to find a way of creating good governance and at the same time reducing the kind of burdens that we're talking about. Now, we have identified some eligibility criteria in our presentation. But how you tie the hands of countries, is a challenge. Of course, there still have to be an arrangement among the creditors and the debtors of what it is. In the HIPIC arrangement, I think you had to have an arrangement with the fund. Ghana, for example, benefited enormously from the HIPIC arrangement. And its debt burden fell, and as you said, it went up over time. I mean, it's not enormously high now. But the point of the matter is that it hadn't solved these structural issues. I think that I agree with you that it's really a bit of a challenge, skepticism and so on. I don't think when ECLAC started this work, the view was that we would have a kind of portmanteau arrangement where everybody would be embraced. But I remember Jamaica, the officials say, listen, we have a serious problem. We can't wait on all the others to solve. We are, we have to move. So we are mindful that there are some countries for whom the challenge is so severe that they can't wait for this broad consensus, which, and there are others, which I suppose like Barbados, still feel that we could do this alone based on our social structure and so on. We have resilience. So I think that we've been caught in this, and we feel that we have to respond to the most urgent and hope that if we have, if we get the buy-in that we want, others will quickly run the success story. That if we have success, others will come on board. With respect to our colleague here, the IMF incentives, I think that we're not talking about new funds. We're not talking about going to colleague, member states and say, listen, we're asking. We were talking about money that is here already. So if they agree in principle that these resources be used for this purpose, and we could have a resilience fund with all the conditions you think are important to guarantee that countries do not fritter away that benefit. I think it will work. As a matter of fact, what Jamaica's been doing is extraordinary. I mean, the impact of the adjustment on this country is extremely severe. And they've continued to pursue the programs, structural reforms and so on. Notwithstanding, I think that they've sent a signal that we are doing all that we can. And I think that you ought to reward that kind of resilience.